Truth, logic, action, power. It's the GreggHoush Show here on New Revolutionary Radio. This is a show where we seek not only to inform, but to inspire you to action. We're going to talk about politics and current events on our program, but we're going to do it from an angle of human rights, civil liberties, and activism. It's our goal to enable an informed citizenry, and we're going to do that by emphasizing critical thinking, news source verification, and actual science versus nonsensical quackery. But most important of all, we hope to inspire you, our listeners, to take action in your community. For while our job is to deliver the clear, verified truth, our talking to you is only a small part of our goals. The real power belongs to you, and it is up to you to decide where your strength lies when facing the real challenges ahead. But know that when you decide to stand up and make a difference, we will stand beside you.
Welcome to the GreggHoush Show, Episode 4. Today we're going to be talking about Russia. I think we might have covered that a little in the last few episodes, but kind of important these days. We're going to specifically be talking about all of Trump's friends and their connections to Russia and what that kind of means to us, and whether it's important, whether it's not, whether it's real. And this all started a few days ago. We got into a conversation here in the office where I somewhat jokingly, but also kind of somewhat believably, said that I thought Paul Manafort was actually working for Russia and was an employee of Putin's whose job it was to go subvert foreign governments and then puppet those leaders. And I did this with the backdrop of the Ukraine and of, America here. We've got 2 in a row now. And we kind of talked about how interesting that job would be if in reality that was his job. And if it was, how he's actually doing a pretty smash up job. Over here at least. I mean, his guy might have gotten removed in the Ukraine, and they might have had Crimea taken from them. Maybe that one was a failure, but he's 1 for 2, right? Mm-hmm. So from there we decided that it would be good to do a bunch of research, actually get some facts correct, bring someone in to give us a bunch of shit, and really. Really talk this one out and see where we ended up. So today I have with me Derek, co-hosting, I believe.
Here as usual.
On duty. Mm-hmm. And Mac and Geneva. Hi. And Geneva's all studied up a little more than us, so I'm fearing the outcome of this one. But here we go, guys. So our engineer / producer / almost everything else here, but being me pretty much, Robert put together a bunch of wonderful notes that we've been studying today that really cover everything and kind of lay out, Trump's connections to Russia going all the way back to 1987. And it's interesting to see how much thicker and thicker those connections get and how much faster the timeline goes as we get nearer to the election and how many more connections are made as he surrounds himself with people like Flynn, like Page, like Manafort. And so we are going to talk about all that today. So how's everyone doing here?
Pretty good.
Pretty good.
Feeling all right, man. Feeling all right. Good to have Geneva here.
Yeah. Good
nice to have someone to, yell at us and give us a lot of shit for everything that we say.
Or at least attack Gregg when it's needed. That's really
that's the high point, yeah, obviously.
Absolutely.
I only yell back.
Right. You definitely don't start the shit, you finish it, right? So, the fun stuff in all this information is, of course, just looking at the tons and tons of failures of Trump's career. His failures to get any business off, really, in Russia. His failure to launch any of his hotel chains for years there. His inability to work with any upstanding Russians. He seems to only be able to work with either the criminal gangs or... I wouldn't say Putin isn't a criminal at this point. I kind of think he is, but
associated with for sure.
He doesn't. I'm positive there are people over there that are good. I know a few of them. Trump doesn't seem to know any of them. And so you look back at all the way back to '87, and you see him visiting Moscow and Leningrad, and you see him attempting to get, his hotel empire expanded to that area, and of course, failing. And you see in '88, you see him getting trolled by fake Gorbachev actors, imposters showing up at his hotel, making him think he might be getting something out of this. But of course, he was fooled. And you see him up into the '90s, you see him talking to artists from Russia about possibly doing big projects in New York that never happen. You see him visiting Moscow again in the hopes with working to build another hotel, which doesn't happen. And it continues and continues until we start to get to his political ambitions when the connections start actually paying off. And so, the conversation as it started was really me and Mac talking with Robert. And first question, I obviously want answered is, my assertion that... completely unfounded, unsourced, with no proof other than the interestingness of looking at it. That Manafort might actually be working for Putin in that specific regard, where he is sent to puppet those foreign leaders.
Before we get into the details on that, it's probably a good idea to give people some background on the post-Soviet Russia and why we suspected in the first place that there might be something like that aside from the U.S. side of things.
Sure, bring some intelligence into the conversation. I've just been rambling.
So, of course, we all know about the fall of the Soviet Union and the late stages of the Soviet Union. There was perestroika by Gorbachev.
Glasnost.
And Glasnost. And, of course, as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the early reforms of the Russian Federation, they took many of the state-owned businesses and privatized them, sold them off to private investors. Of course, they were sold to Russian investors in the early post-communist era, which, if you think about it, raises a lot of questions about where those people got enough money to be bidding on $100 million companies. And I think you can speak a little bit to this topic, that a lot of the times it was because they were part of the Russian mafia or other criminal enterprises in Russia during the Soviet era, or they took advantage of government connections in the early post-Soviet era and late Soviet era to make themselves very rich in the first place, or have everyone else that might bid on those companies killed.
Yeah, this is an interesting tie-in. I spent a little time in Moscow. Our government's a bit upset about that one, but I did in the mid-'90s. And one of the interesting things about Moscow that time period is that you didn't run into anyone driving a nice car that wasn't involved in crime. It just wasn't the thing. The only people eating good food and not waiting 7-8 hours in line for bread were the criminals. And more interesting in that time period was the real push of personal computing, of the internet, of all of that being a huge economic driver in America and starting to drive some capital and some of the GDP over in Russia. When that started, the only people who had any money that weren't just the government were the mob. And you see groups like the Russian Business Network, the RBN, and other groups like that were just literally nice names on top of the mafia. Starting up ISPs, internet service providers, starting up computer stores, think like our old CompUSA, stores like that, and making a lot of money. And, almost every industry went that way. When they privatized... more of their oil, more of their gas. They handed that off to government friends. And when you looked at it, people like Yeltsin and whatnot weren't really paying much attention to it or caring, it seemed.
I mean, to be fair, Boris Yeltsin was a bit, involved with vodka bottles.
Yeah, he might not have been able to see it through the haze. But yeah, I mean, the entire time period was just full of the criminals really getting more and more powerful. And strange enough, I mean, while you look at Putin and you look at a lot of the stuff that he's done as negative, I mean, everything from their stance on LGBT rights to all the, I don't know, dead journalists to everything else. You've got to say this is a bad man. But when you look at almost how more organized and less violent the crime gangs got under him and how he was kind of able to, I guess, bring them into the fold, it definitely made it a slightly nicer place to live if you were a Russian, which was always crazy. Yeah, very much so. A lot of my friends that I had made while I was there and other friends that I've made, I talked to them a few years ago. This was probably 2012, and I had this big conversation about why aren't there more people showing up to these anti-Putin protests in the streets? And their responses were very much boiled down, distilled here to it doesn't take 6 hours to get bread anymore. I don't want to go back to that. That's his doing. So I want him to stay until that becomes a problem for me. And of course, you get into all the fun arguments about, first they came for this person, I said nothing. Then they came for that person, I said nothing. Soon they're coming for me, right? But at that point, when I was having that conversation with these people, their only care was, my dad's got a Mercedes. We live in a nice 3-bedroom in a suburb that wasn't there before him. And the crime doesn't seem to be bothering our family too much. So we're in a happier place. And that was really weird because it meant it was really hard for any of us who were thinking about helping organizers on the ground get bigger protests going. It wasn't going to be possible. It was really strange to see people putting up with his style of authoritarian leadership simply because their life was slightly easier.
Yeah, and of course, the early stages of the post-Soviet era, there was a lot of uncertainty, and no one really knew what was going to happen in Russia. But eventually power kind of coalesced under this group of oligarchs, and when Putin first came to power, wasn't entirely friendly with them. But then over time kind of made associations with them. Some of them, fell out of power, died under mysterious circumstances sometimes, or not so mysterious circumstances sometimes. But as a result, he's kind of taken the criminal enterprises and the semi-criminal enterprises and the oligarchs and the intelligence apparatus, which of course he's a former member of the KGB, and kind of welded them together into a power structure that's kind of formed a more or less functional state in Russia. I mean, for certain definitions of functional.
Sure, but the one thing that you have to always, add to that is when asked about, being a former KGB agent, his own responses are always that there are no former KGB agents.
This is true.
So, it's very much speaking to his mentality and how he consolidated all that power at the top and, the tactics he used to do it. He kind of doesn't care that people know and think that about him.
Yeah, it kind of enhances his reputation in Russia, too, because people are like, that's someone that gets shit done.
Seems to fit it.
But also
right?
speaking to your comment about how when you went over there, it seemed like, everyone that gained any power in the early years was either part of organized crime or, had government connections of some kind. It's interesting. I ran across a interview with Stephen Hall, the former CIA chief of Russian operations a few years ago, in which he said, quote, anybody who is an oligarch or is in any position of power in Russia got it because Vladimir Putin or somebody in power saw some reason to give that person that job. All the organized crime figures I've ever heard of in Russia all have deep connections and are tied in with people in government. So that wasn't just something that was true in the 1990s. It's also something that was true according to the CIA as of relatively recently.
It seems to be a working kind of symbiotic relation they have there to each other. It's interesting because we did learn a piece of it. Like a lot of the questions I get because of my specialties being, in computer security and all that fun stuff is why are so many of the hackers and hacking tools Russian and why aren't the Russians doing anything about it? And throughout a lot of the deeper investigations into their involvement in the possible hacking of the elections and everything else, some of the information that came out of the intelligence industry was that Russia was allowing people like the creator of the Zeus banking malware to continue using it and continue building it and supporting all their users that were defrauding people all over the world, because they had a backdoor into the software and they could use machines it got onto to gather information. And it was so good at spreading and had such a large network that they were able to get into machines that they might not have otherwise. And so that led to the interesting discussions about the simple fact that they're allowing all the hackers to hack, because if you do something amazing, then they're just going to come take you and say, you like to live and you're a really good hacker, so you work for us now. And if you do something that just doesn't prove you to be a great hacker, but proves very beneficial to them, like the Zeus malware creator, they're just going to piggyback on what you do and let you continue to do it. And that was always interesting, because that's kind of a tie-in to a piece of why they are allowing a lot of the crime to happen. Because one, their economy isn't doing as well as it could be, and I got to imagine the amount of crime that they allow to happen, including even in the computer space, with so much of the credit card fraud and everything else going through Russia and some of its former Soviet nations who still have a lot of really close ties. That a percentage of their GDP, and noticeable one, is made up of crime, and that's not me being negative on the Russian population. It's just the government allowing it to happen because of the state of affairs with their current economy.
And it brings about a state of fear for a lot of the citizens there, because in most other developed nations, you have the governments or politicians at least pretending, having enough respect to pretend that it's not just all about the bias for the rich, or in Russia, the oligarchs in particular. You make billions of dollars for people, and the loyalty that comes with that, the influence that comes with that, the power that comes with that is probably really overwhelming for people that are even below, middle class, lower middle class standards, if not below the poverty line already.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, Russia has had a very sizable, persistent high unemployment rate. I've seen numbers before saying that outside of the major cities, it's often as high as about 20%. And so there's entire communities where there's huge numbers of people that are just, there are no jobs there. So very little ability or resources to marshal against the oligarchs if they wanted to. So it makes it even more overwhelming seeming to them, because they've got, the money, the connections, they live in the cities where everyone that matters is, that they feel very left out of any sort of power structures or progress.
It's a defeated mind state to begin with, right? So,
well, this is where, this information really kind of becomes, relevant. We have a situation where Russia really does feel backed into a corner. They feel, that their backs are up against the wall because, one, you look at like the Ukraine possibly becoming a NATO nation, and NATO is very clearly, around. It exists to defeat Russian aggression.
Yeah, that was their original charter was against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so what would you, if you were Russia, want, a NATO nation literally on your border, with a border, that close to Moscow? I understand them not wanting that, but at the same time, how they're going about it is definitely not something anyone should be happy with. And I think the other thing to really consider here, as our engineer is so quick to remind me of, is Dick Cheney in 1992 had a document. He was defense secretary at the time. 46-page document where he asserted very clearly that the American mission going forward will be, quote, convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. And what he's really saying is that, now that Russia's down and China hasn't really made that big surge yet, America is the only superpower, and we're going to try and make sure that no one else gets up here, and we're just going to stay on top and keep you all down. And I think a lot of what they did there and what they worked on during that time period helped to put Russia in the situation where its economy currently is, and really helped to empower all the people that keep voting Putin into power.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, if you think about the situation during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was legitimately a superpower and made up, well, the Warsaw Pact as a whole made up a sizable portion of the world's economy. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, you're now looking at, the Russian Federation, which lost, from their perspective, huge amounts of territory as the independent republics broke off. And now they're, 2% of the world GDP? And the U.S. is not only this much larger part as on its own, but the U.S. has NATO, which represents most of the rest of the industrialized world. And, they make up, just the U.S. and its close allies, something like half the world GDP. So they feel like at one time they were, respected and powerful. And now there's these people throwing their weight around, and from their perspective, bullying them. It's only natural that Russia would feel like it's backed into a corner.
You do definitely have this weird situation where the American military is backed by quite a large economy and an economy way larger than Russia's currently. And Russia's military, besides maybe China's, is probably the closest in power and technological advancement to ours. Yet their economy is, well, in the shitter. I mean, it's nothing compared to ours. And that is an interesting dynamic you find yourself with two super powerful militaries, and one with funding drying up. And I would assume backed into that corner, a lot of more interesting things become possible that weren't before. A lot more activity.
Well, I mean, we've seen a lot of that since pretty much Putin came to power. We saw that with Chechnya. We saw that with South Ossetia. We saw that with Ukraine in Crimea. They've definitely kind of, every time Putin's approval ratings start to slump because of domestic problems in Russia, Russia invades one of its former satellite republics. Seems to be an ongoing trend.
Yeah, one of the interesting stats about the military, I believe the U.S. military defense budget is $597 billion. I mean, it's $600 billion, and the Russian budget is 66 billion. I mean, that is how different we are currently.
Of course, there's a difference in purchasing power parity there, since the wages you have to pay someone in the U.S. to do anything are so much higher just to get the same standard of living than they would be in Russia. So there is definitely,
you have that, but then you also have most of the U.S. R&D not being protected by any true cybersecurity. So
yes.
We pay for a lot more of the R&D
Yes.
than Russia does. I think they might
That
be
does
borrowing
seem
some
likely.
from us. Just a little. So that's a little expense off of them. But then also I think, while there's a lot of backroom dealings here in America, and there are just as many there, and just as many bribes thrown around on both sides, I believe in the military-industrial complex. Over here, you've got a lot more overhead built in to very old, slow companies. Northrop Grumman, Lockheed. And there's so much inefficiency built into those systems that they're just used to bidding, out these gigantic numbers, and the revolving door of their employees, and then the employees in actual defense for America are just signing off on these gigantic numbers. Where in Russia, I think if one of Lockheed's quotes was handed over to Putin, he'd look at it and then say, this person needs to go to prison for this number. So I think they get to cut a lot of the wasteful spending out of their military budget that we don't, which is a good thing and a bad thing because of why they're able to do it, but a good thing that they are able to do it.
They also have a lot lower. The U.S. is very focused on force projection, and since there's not really much of anywhere for the U.S. to project force in its own continent, it's very focused on being able to project military power overseas. So we have this huge Navy. We have, I believe, 11 carrier groups. That's like more super carriers than the rest of the world combined.
Yeah, there's a really good article in Vice. It's strange to say that. That was a weird sentence. But there's a really good article in Vice, funny enough, from 2013 about the ability for the rest of the world in its entirety to come together as one force and invade the U.S. and win. And if you actually listen to the article and you really read it, it includes U.S. military officials, it includes experts, it includes foreign experts. They very convincingly laugh it off as it's not possible to invade America and win. You literally can't. If you read the article, it's a really interesting read. You might agree with it, you might not, but it talks about our ability to defend our homeland is actually a lot easier than a lot of these other nations who have large exposed borders to possible enemies. I mean, Canada's not really our enemy.
Not as such.
So, that's very interesting. But all of that kind of builds this picture of a Russia where it's got its back up against the wall for a while now. It's lost a lot of its power in the world as of, I guess you want to say about a decade ago. It really was looking a lot weaker than it does today. And sure, some of the outlook you see today is because of the posturing, because of the stuff that Putin's been doing. And so they're kind of, flexing, and you can now see, oh yeah, we weren't really thinking about them for a few years there, but yeah, they're scary. And, we get to this point where they decide, based on a lot of good sources, we now know that they decide that they definitely want Trump to win this thing and that they don't want Hillary to win this thing. And, it brings us up to this point where we've got an election that they are very pro one of the candidates. And how much of an effect that had on this election is kind of the next part of our conversation. What do we believe here?
I mean, I want to just throw in before we get to that
he loves to do this to me.
To be fair, it's not like the U.S. and other countries never fuck with anyone's elections either. We've overthrown more than a couple of democratically elected governments, and we've certainly spied on, even our own allies. So
a lot.
A lot. So, we're not going to pretend
I was not pretending any of that.
Right,
just
but,
look back at Vietnam. I mean, Ho Chi Minh was democratically elected, and boy, did we mess some stuff up there.
But that doesn't change the fact, we can say that, hey, the U.S. has done this, but that doesn't mean that, it's justified.
Make it right.
Yeah, we can complain about the fact that the U.S. was doing it. I've been complaining about the fact the U.S.
was doing it.
I
think that seems a little too past tense for me.
Has been.
Yes.
Gotta get a sod out, dude. Gotta get him out.
I mean, I agree with that, though. I want to just, literally bomb whatever building he's in currently, please.
That's your business.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying I should do this? I mean, that sure sounded like I was just nominated to go do that. And I gotta say, for the record, I have no plans to actually do that.
You have a mantle now if you need it.
Personally. So, yeah, sure. We've done all of the stuff, I think, that we are claiming Putin to be doing. Not to ourselves, Now it's time to talk about, Russia doing it to us specifically.
Now that someone else has done it to us, maybe we can have that serious conversation about why doing this is bad.
Sure. I mean, I don't think any of us in this room think it's good.
Well, no, I meant like we as a society rather than
the royal we.
Yeah.
I'm there with you. All right, so let's dig into that a little. I mean, obviously we have to decide, do we care that Russia did this? I mean, do we first think that them having nothing to do with it at all would have really changed things? Do we think that he wins anyways? I think it was close enough that they moved the needle 1 or 2%, and that was enough to put him over the top. I think without them involved, that Hillary wins, just barely. I mean, I still think it's close, but...
Well, I mean, literally, the margin that mattered, if you go by the electoral votes, was 70,000 votes over the space of a few states. It doesn't really... That's out of, well over 100 million ballots cast. That's a tiny percentage. It does not take very much movement to have swung an election at that point.
Right. So then, what was their involvement? Were they just talking with, Trump's team? Were they talking with people who they then found ways to make part of Trump's team? Did they work to get Manafort, Flynn, and people like this onto Trump's team on purpose because they were already talking to them and things like that? How deep does this go? Did they just have conversations with people Trump was already thinking about? Or did they make him hire these people? and make might be a strong word, but, according to an interesting post that BuzzFeed made that had zero sources, they might have some interesting information on Trump that would allow them to make him do things.
Well, Trump was hiring just about anybody because, no Republicans wanted anything to do with his campaign, and they were basically just pulling people on left and right. I mean, when Page got onto the campaign in March, he was basically just thrown on a list with a bunch of other people, basically because they needed people to be on the list. And ultimately, he ended up getting no badge, never signed a non-disclosure agreement, never was on the campaign payroll, and never got a campaign email at all.
And according to Trump, at least at one point, they never met.
Yeah, there was a lot of people who were involved in the Trump campaign said they never saw him in Trump Tower. Kellyanne Conway said he's certainly not part of the campaign I'm running.
Right, but then, his name is all over all sorts of Trump stuff, and he is, listed literally everywhere you can find information about that campaign for months. Carter Page is somewhere to be involved. So
Trump was literally the one that chose to name him as one of his foreign policy advisors when he had
publicly
5 names and someone asked him a question in an interview.
And isn't this something that Putin wanted back in 2008 and even 2012 possibly with Obama? But maybe just didn't have the leverage or wasn't allowed to go as far as he's been allowed to do now and be as public about what he's done?
Let's say, do you believe that any of the Democrats running at that time would have allowed themselves to almost be puppeted by Putin in the way that we're, possibly describing Trump as being here?
Public relations puppeted and actually having the influence over that politician could be 2 different things. Would they have allowed him back then to, display this, put puffing the chest out, acting as if he had the control, and maybe just the dismissive nature of how they would handle it back then might be a lot different now where, Trump's more enabling them to take that PR stunt to show the Russian people for Putin's sake that he has that much power.
I think we run into the very simple question of how intelligent do you think Trump is? I think the other people, over those years weren't as open to suggestion as Trump is,
Maybe
to put it lightly.
Politically savvy.
Yes, and his inability to really filter anything before he says it or does it allows him a little more, allows him to be influenced a little more by people like Putin, whereas the other people like Obama and whatnot would never have. And I think that's definitely a piece of it. He's an easier target.
At least Obama would allow his advisors a lot more say and a lot more influence. He had a lot more trust in them maybe than Trump's been willing to give publicly, if not privately, up to this point as well.
You can barely trust anybody.
And Obama, like most politicians and specifically presidents, taps assets in terms of bringing in advisors and stuff from a very deep well of sort of the people that are involved in government. They know they have kind of a history. They're known. That it's a lot harder to infiltrate someone than it is if you're dealing with someone who doesn't really have any sort of history at finding these level of advisors, and just like what happened with Carter Page, where his name ended up on an email list because he signed up for it.
So this brings us to Manafort, I think, really. I mean, I want to talk Manafort, this guy.
Yeah,
he is kind of one of the most prominently associated.
A real shill.
It seems to be that Manafort, of any of these people, I mean, sure, Flynn obviously met with, the Russians multiple times, and watching him squirm in TV interviews when he said things like, I don't really, I might have met them in Cleveland, shit like that. Like, it was hilarious. But Manafort is the easiest here. He definitely met with them. Definitely worked with them. Extensively for years, most notably in the Ukraine in support of Yanukovych and all the other puppets that Russia had in power there at that point that the Ukrainian people overthrew. And I think one of the funniest, pieces of the story for Manafort is that a lot of the information we have about what he might have done in the Ukraine comes from the fact that he left there to come back over here and do some work. And when someone took over his office over there in Ukraine, they found a ledger that shows payments from the Russian governments, from Russian spies, from all kinds of other people. And depending on, what pieces of those stories you believe, it's anywhere from $12 million to $40 million he got out of them. But he denies that ledger is his. However, it has been, quite extensively proven to have been his.
And then he, said, oh, well, at first he was saying, the ledger is complete fake. And then later I was like, well, okay, well, any payments, I did lots of work for people, and any payments I took were totally on the books. So it's all above board.
Well, Manafort also works with all kinds of people, from dictators in the Philippines to warlords in Angola. I mean, he seems to just go where money goes. He worked on Ford's campaign. He worked on a cable television campaign.
He's for hire.
He's for
He is,
hire.
definitely.
And he, in his own words, he said, the simplest answer is the truth. He's a campaign professional. So I don't think that necessarily means he's a pawn for Russia, as much as it means that he'll take money where he can get it.
Right, but doesn't that make him a pawn for Russia if they paid him enough to be influencing Trump in specific ways?
Well, he's also being sued by a Russian oligarch for about $19 million right now for taking money for a cable television campaign and then not communicating about it at all.
Technically, his agency is being sued by a company that is a subsidiary that's owned by that oligarch, because none of this is all shell companies. And it's actually, I looked into that story a little while ago, and it's actually kind of funny, like what actually was going on there, because the oligarch, who's someone that Manafort has done quite a bit of work for. In fact, that oligarch is Oleg Deripaska, and he is actually one of the big Putin allies that Manafort has been associated with in the past. In fact, you may have heard about the memos that got leaked from 2005, where Manafort was saying how he had a plan to greatly benefit the Putin government and involve lobbying Western governments to allow oligarchs to keep possession of the formerly state-owned assets in Ukraine, building long-term relationships with Western journalists, all sorts of stuff. Well, that memo was to Oleg Deripaska, and that was about less than a year before Oleg Deripaska signed a $10 million a year contract to get Manafort doing work for him that lasted for several years at least. So, he had a long history with this guy. And then he and his partner convinced this company to invest ultimately a total of about $18.9 million, plus about $7.5 million in management and consulting fees in this plan to acquire a bunch of local cable networks in Eastern Europe to sort of profit off of and combine into larger conglomerates. And they ended up only ever buying one of them. And then the court documents are hilarious, because they're like, we had problems starting in 2008 because they'd only bought one and we weren't really sure what was going on. So we decided we wanted to, kind of get our money back out. And by the time that was arranged, it was arranged that they were going to try and sell our stake, 2008, 2009, financial collapse, no one's looking to buy. But then, so we tried to get them to, give us invoices of what they actually spent the money on. And, well, we spent several years trying to get that information from them, and then they just stopped talking to us.
Yeah, it seems like a weird thing to do if you want, good relations with somebody, though.
I mean, he may not have cared that much about that individual company.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a guy that's worth, not Manafort, but Deripaska is worth $5+ billion. For a long time, he was the richest man in Russia. And this was just one. I mean, the company in question that was the one that lost the money is called, or that invested the money is Surf Horizon Limited. It's not exactly his primary business. So he may not, it may have just been a, well, okay, that deal fell through, he maybe Manafort skimmed off the top. I'm not too worried about that. Like, whatever, small change.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, when you look at Deripaska there, and you look back at actually the cable leaks that happened on WikiLeaks there is a cable in 2006 that describes him as among the 2 or 3 oligarchs Putin turns to on a regular basis and a more or less permanent fixture on Putin's trips abroad. So this is someone who Manafort was working with on multiple projects, who was that close to Putin. And
he was actually brought in on other projects due to his connection to that guy with other Russian oligarchs and in Ukrainian projects with oligarchs there as well.
So, I mean, proving Manafort's connection to Russia isn't really proving. It's more just talking about his connection to Russia because, I mean, we all know that one. That one is pretty simple. But I will say that part of the information related to them buying up those TV networks and that whole kind of plan, that conspiracy was not only Eastern Europe, but they were actually planning on buying up local networks in the U.S. to very subtly spread Russian propaganda that made Putin look a little better. Part of the plan described it as I'm not remembering the exact wordage, but it was something about the thinnest possible propaganda they could come up with, so it would not look like propaganda. You would barely notice, and they were trying to not only do that in Eastern Europe, in some of the former Soviet countries, but also right here in America. And Manafort was the one who actually wrote up the proposal stating that he would spread Russian propaganda in the U.S. to influence Russians, Putin and Russia's view in U.S. politics. And I find that very interesting that he then ends up on Trump's campaign.
It's also very interesting the way that he did work for the nature of the work and length of time that he was associated with the Ukraine Party of Regions, which is, of course, Yanukov's party. And they've since rebranded. I forget what they've rebranded to, but that was at his suggestion. And he did a lot of work with them. And among the amounts that he did, one of the things he did was in 2012, he helped them secretly funnel $2.2 million to 2 prominent Washington lobbying firms to lobby in the United States.
So there we have it. Manafort, that's a pretty easy one. And Page, I mean, obviously another pretty easy one. He even admits to having meetings. Flynn, of course, has meetings. Sessions, either due to senility or outright lying, does lie and says that he didn't have meetings when he did. Maybe some of the Republicans who apologize for him and say, well, yeah, but that was part of his job. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong.
I mean, it should probably be noted that he was not on the Foreign Relations Committee. He was on the Armed Services Committee. And the other 25 members of the Armed Services Committee all said, no, we never met with the Russian ambassador in 2016.
Exactly.
So that does seem a little weird as a justification.
A lot of it seems like a lot of hearsay, which in the official trial, didn't end up holding up. You had Comey having no evidence, presenting no evidence. You had no one in the FBI presenting any evidence of any connection to Russia.
Comey specifically repeatedly said, there was very little he could actually discuss because it was an open hearing. Yeah. And
that the information was classified that he did have.
There was, for example, when the Republicans were questioning him about a meeting that he had to brief Donald Trump when he was the president-elect, and it was a meeting at Trump Tower that was reported on in the news. Comey specifically commented that he wouldn't even acknowledge whether that meeting happened for fear of possibly confirming any leaked information of a classified nature. So he is very circumspect and trying to avoid saying anything that could even confirm or deny leaks asserting to be containing classified material.
Because they don't publicly talk about ongoing investigations.
Yeah, but you also had, the chairman is almost, if you like watch, in the trial, he's almost begging him for any kind of evidence at all. He's just like, please give us evidence. He says like
But
six.
they do that all the
times.
time, though. I mean, that's if you see, like a lot of people watched this one and maybe watched one or two others due to all of this Trump drama, who haven't spent the last like decade watching the rest of them. And man, I must be just boring because I've watched like 100 of these, and that type of grilling is unbelievably standard, and no answer is pretty much the average.
He's asking because he didn't have any, right?
Well, he didn't want to specify any classified information he had on the subject, so he was trying to get. Essentially, what they do is they try and get the person they're talking to say something that they think that the person thinks they can, say without breaching classified information rules. But everyone is super careful because no one wants to be the guy that breaks classified information rules, especially when it's, a hearing in the open in Congress that everyone's paying attention to, because that is a way to get in a lot of trouble quickly.
Right. So at this point, we only know that an investigation is happening.
Mm-hmm.
He has at least admitted that, which took a while for him to admit. He definitely fought against that for a little bit. He would neither deny or confirm for a little bit, but now he has confirmed the investigation is ongoing. We have all these other fun people all the way up to Sessions. Then
Something like 10 different Trump associates, and I mean not like,
And you brought up the point that a lot of it's hearsay, and sure, there's a lot of hearsay involved here, but when the hearsay ends up being and this person and this person, and you get to the point where there's literally no one within 100 feet of Trump who isn't reported to have done this, and that the ones that you finally do end up with any hard evidence turn out to have actually done it, it starts to paint a picture of this is probably true.
Well, then you have, like you brought up Flynn, but Flynn didn't register as a foreign agent for Russia at all. He registered as one for Turkey.
And Erdogan is very much supported by Putin at this point. So
at this point, but not at that point.
I don't believe that.
Oh.
Personally, just that is just me. But I think Erdogan and Putin are good buddies. They seem to like to rule in the same way.
And the Turkey in the last few years has been pursuing a lot of the same sort of influence campaigns and foreign policy strategies that Russia has been doing under Putin. So either they're taking lessons or, directly communicating.
Some of the stuff that has come out about, Comey and about the investigation and other things that, sources, of course, in the intelligence community. But boy, there are a lot of those talking lately. That they believe Guccifer is, just a front. Guccifer being the one who supposedly hacked all this fun stuff. That he is just a front of the Russian military hacking operations. And one of the more interesting claims made by people in the intelligence agencies is that he had something to do with the DCCC hack. He had something to do a little with a DNC hack. And that all of that information, plus a bunch of other information that we know came from an American, not the Russians, got to WikiLeaks. And one of the interesting claims that has been reported by multiple actual sources out there, I believe the Post was one of the ones I read, was that here is Julian Assange sitting on a bunch of data, and Trump, through Putin, I'm sure it was, one of Trump's aides and one of his aides, but still, Trump through Putin was telling Julian Assange when to release things. So Trump's campaign was saying that if you release this piece now, it'll do the most damage based on what we're doing and based on, where Hillary is, to Hillary's campaign. And they were telling that to the Russians, who were then telling Assange when to release things, and then he was releasing them. And that's really interesting. Some of their sources are interesting. Most of it's anonymously sourced. Most of it's an insider in the intelligence community and all that fun stuff because, it's classified information that they're talking about. But let's assuming, some truth to that, you look at Well, actually, funny enough, I'm just reading about the DMs, the Twitter DMs with Guccifer and
Roger Stone.
yeah, Roger Stone. Stone actually posted screenshots of these things, and in one of them, Guccifer actually worried that Assange was working closely with the Russians, and so imagining that this stuff is true based on the multiple sources you start to see it from. That would be really interesting and possibly treasonous, working with the Russians to leak hacked U.S. data to affect our election.
I think it's possibly treasonous to delete 30,000 emails and then not deliver them when given a subpoena by the FBI.
Well, once deleted, I mean, you can't deliver them. So, I mean,
yeah, but
So I agree entirely. This is interesting because I'm sure a lot of this comes off as Trump bashing. Although I really don't. I mean, let's be blunt here. I don't give a fuck. I think both sides are horrible. I didn't want either of them. She would have been a disastrous president, although I think he is a more disastrous president. I will admit to thinking Bernie would have been a little fun. I would have liked to have seen what he did. No idea if he would have been a good president or not, but I think that would have been more fun than what we're going through right now. But going back to it, I mean, so sure, she definitely did some things, but just because this guy's done some things doesn't mean we can't talk about this other guy over here doing things.
Oh, for sure. I think that it's been very clear, like throughout the mainstream media, that most of the aggression and most of the focus is going on the bad things and the secret things that happened in Trump's campaign, which are, like we said, largely based on hearsay and a lack of evidence. Whereas a lot of the things that Clinton did were actually proven, and there's like concrete things that got released proving that, like, say, the Clinton Foundation took money from people who then got favors done for them by Hillary Clinton's wallet.
Sure, and Trump is changing regulations for all of his billionaire friends and hiring his billionaire friends into positions of government so they can make more money. He is removing regulations out of things like, say, the EPA so his friends can make more money. I mean,
which is interesting that, this actually that a lot of the terrible things that he does on the domestic front like that receive comparatively little attention in the media. We mostly just hear about Russia. We don't hear nearly as much about gutting environmental regulations.
Yeah, putting Pruitt as the head of the EPA was, I mean, wow. How do you get there? In your head, how do you, even if you are just nothing but pure evil, how do you even justify that? That was disturbing. But back to it. I mean, so yeah, absolutely. Clinton and her whole team, everyone involved, I think, were just nothing good there. But so what? That's over there. That's other people. We're talking about someone who we believe did something treasonous. What she did, what we believe she did, and what we believe there might even be proof of her doing was criminal. But criminal in the terms of you owe some fines and maybe some jail time is far different than treasonous by a sitting president. Like we're orders of magnitude here. Someone forced you to stub your toe. The other person just murdered 5 people. I don't like her, and I don't like all the criminal activity that she is accused of doing, and some of it which I believe has been proven.
She tried to force her way into presidency.
Sure. And I mean, talking about that, I mean, let's just for a moment say one thing. I mean, if you look at her husband, and then the Bushes, and then their fun friends, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and everyone else, you can go back to the mid-'70s all the way up until very recently and see kind of 2 families and 2 or 3 of their close friends in complete control of everything from the presidency down.
And there's a little bit more distant connections with people that are consistently involved. Henry Kissinger,
Exactly. But so there's easily 2 kind of dynasties that have been going on for a while now, and similar to Putin, who is, in power for a couple years, and then someone else has to take the presidency while he becomes PM, and then they swap positions again, so he takes his presidency back. I don't know how long he plays that game before he just says, nope, there's no more term limits or any of that stupid stuff. I'm just for life.
Done with that now.
Right.
but for now he's playing the game. Sure. So you've got Clinton. I believe really bad idea for this country. I really, really wish the Democrats had done something different there. But we're talking about Russia.
Right.
And I don't think the Russians and her really liked each other too much.
Not so
No,
much.
certainly not.
I think they worked pretty hard to get rid of her. I think they put in a lot of effort to make sure she didn't win. And, if any of those connections to Assange are proven, in that, he was somehow being coordinated or coordinating with purposely the Russians to release information based on when Trump wanted it out there. Even if he was doing it unknowingly, even if he didn't know that the Russians were doing it, he was still, doing that. I think one of the ways that you, as Assange, would justify that is there's information out there, very proven information that she had talks and plans to kill Assange. She wanted him dead.
Yeah.
So I could see why Assange might want to work against her and maybe not let her become president. I don't know if I had that kind of power over the election cycle at that point, and someone who had talked about killing me might become the U.S. president, I might not want her to win.
And for folks, Greg, that
Fair
are less
enough.
familiar with what the sources are on that information, can you review those?
I mean, sure. The sources for all of that, actually, the biggest source for all the information about what Clinton was planning against WikiLeaks is WikiLeaks. Actually putting classified documentation out there that proved all this fun stuff. So, little self-referential there. But
Where does WikiLeaks get that information?
leakers, people who don't think it's right, that stuff that was going on, hackers who might break into systems. I mean, one of the more interesting pieces about this whole story is everyone loves to talk about Podesta's emails and all the other emails that WikiLeaks gave out, and we know that the hackers didn't take those emails. It was a disaffected DNC staffer, Seth Rich. He took all the information and gave it over to WikiLeaks, the emails specifically. And he was dead about a week later, under mysterious circumstances that ended up not really getting investigated. But he handed over the information in a park in D.C. on U.S. soil. And so that's interesting. Now, if you look at it, the people who were close to that situation who have spoken say it's because he was very much a Bernie supporter, and he wanted Bernie to win this thing, and he was really upset at the DNC working against Bernie and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Podesta, and all these people working against Bernie with their power. So it wasn't the Russians who got those emails, but from all we can tell, it looks like they were the ones who helped coordinate when they got released and why.
And I think some of the people that are familiar with WikiLeaks from more recent times, they had an impression in the past that WikiLeaks had their own bias, their own skewing, their own subjectivity and what type of information they put out, what side they were on, let's say. And a lot of people, I think, saw a more liberal bias in the past, whereas more recently, when WikiLeaks during the elections especially was releasing a lot of information about, Clinton's campaign and the Democratic Party and the DNC, I think people got confused about whose side exactly they were on, when in reality, they're not really on a side, are they?
No, a lot of people believed, Julian, WikiLeaks, leakers, whistleblowers, to seemingly fall to the left and be more democratic, as just kind of a default way of being. And if you look back at the history of specifically WikiLeaks, you'll see a lot of anti-war, anti-aggression, a lot of things that you normally find on the left in their actions. But one of the interesting things that you really have to understand about a group like them is they put out what they get. They don't actively seek out information.
Right.
And so what they get is what gets out. And they happen to get a lot of stuff against her. Now, there's rumors, unsubstantiated claims that hackers specifically got into the RNC and got some of the Republican data, and none of it ever got released. Whether, that's true, whether it made it to WikiLeaks at all, we don't know. I mean, it's one of those, unknown unknowns, so we really just have no idea. But there have been, reports that supposedly happened from unnamed sources.
Right, and WikiLeaks isn't necessarily, obviously, they're by definition, they're not going to release where the information comes from. However, what are the channels they go through to make sure they verify that type of intelligence before it goes out?
So, they've got their own apparatus at this point that helps them verify some of this information. And they do actually, funny enough, reach out to some of the people the information is about just to verify some of it. I doubt they get much in the way of responses, asking Podesta, is this your email? Probably got a big fuck you. But they then rely heavily on a lot of the old school methodology here. They rely on old school reporters, journalists, and newspapers and outlets that have really strong apparatuses for developing that information and proving the veracity of any of the claims in it. And so sometimes they'll release stuff with not as much backup as they might need to prove the source, but a lot of times when they put something out, they've talked to journalists who have sources close enough to it that they've proven to themselves that it's true, that it's right. And you'll see something interesting with a lot of the newer releases. They're more and more redactions are getting added into these things. More and more care is being taken about what's being released. Now, some of the people who care about this specifically are saying, well, that's because they're actually cutting things too. They're not reporting things that aren't part of their agenda. And again, that's one of those things we won't know unless we have secondary leaks of the information, which in one case, some of the Podesta emails, we actually did, get some secondary leaking there that showed that information. So, yeah.
So it seems the first thing people can look at, understand exactly who's leaking the information in is, what would be the motive behind it? Just like, any police officers or any government agency would look at, number one, who had the motive and who had the means to leak information. Obviously, the means could be a lot of different people. It could be hackers. It could be hackers hired by a government. It could be teams. It could be private consultancies. So obviously people who, in this particular case, the DNC hacks, for instance, people who wanted to cause some damage to the credibility, the reputation of that group. But if we go back just a few steps to the theme of one party versus the other. So we go back to that campaign and we say, it was established corruption, with Democratic Party, specifically Hillary Clinton's campaign, established corruption. I think the biggest part you brought up earlier, people were passionate about, especially in this country, was in the United States, was that, Bernie was not given a fair opportunity as what was seen, and the more information that came out, the more they saw it was more of the same, more of the established corruption of the establishment.
And we end up with Debbie Wasserman Schultz having to resign.
Which is a pretty ugly situation.
Well, I mean...
Brazil doing basically the same.
Yeah. But both sides of this election were not good. But I find it interesting that, we don't get this deep of a view of what goes on behind scenes in these types of elections when you don't have Trump in them. I think, one, his inability to build a really politically strong group of people around him, and instead grabbing in a lot of these almost like mercenary types like Manafort, like who just, works for the dollar and nothing else, led us to having a lot more information simply because they made a lot of mistakes that, career politicians that were only politicians wouldn't have made. And that leads to then, mudslinging. Well, what about the other side? And then we hear all these things internally that, we wouldn't have heard about Clinton's campaign. And so in some regards, it's been kind of a good thing that all this was happening because we got to see a lot more of the inner workings of how bad these campaigns really are. But
it's very enlightening, yeah.
On the other side, we have a president who quite possibly committed treason multiple times to become president, and possibly multiple times afterward. And,
being was likely manipulated by other people who themselves quite possibly committed treason. That's almost the best case scenario at this point.
Yeah, and as Geneva so rightly pointed out, a lot of the claims when we get that strong, when we get to the point where we're saying the treason word, that's a strong word. And a lot of the claims that get us there are indeed hearsay. But you get them backed up by so much hearsay, by so many different sources, and then so many of the pieces of the stories that these sources have said start to become true. Like Flynn was working as a foreign agent forever. Finally, months after we already know this to be true, he registers after saying for a while that he wasn't. As parts of the story from some of these same sources start to become true, a lot of the hearsay starts to sound a lot less like hearsay and a lot more like fact.
Well, I think that a lot of the reason that all of these things are getting put together and all these lines are getting drawn between the dots is largely because Donald Trump himself is existentially a threat to the establishment that's in place. And so when you make so many rich, powerful people angry, they're going to take everything that they can and put it together to try and discredit you. And I think that's a lot of why this whole Russia hacking narrative has even happened. When you were talking about Putin earlier and how people in Russia are fine with Putin and they're enjoying the fact that their way of life is improved.
Some aren't, but it's surprising, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that Trump had a lot of support in the United States for similar reasons. That a lot of people are in support of his traditionalist views, and a lot of people are in support of his.
He doesn't have traditionalist views. He just said he did. He said he was going to drain the swamp, and then he put Sessions in as AG. Sessions isn't draining the swamp.
Well, I don't mean in the drain the swamp way.
No, but what I'm saying is he claimed all these views, and he made all these promises that he hasn't kept one of. That all of the views he has proven not to actually believe. I mean, traditionalist conservative views, do those involve grabbing a pussy? I don't think they do. I'm just personally, I think conservatism to me, while not married to, but is definitely more along the Christian value system than it is the Donald Trump value system. So the right leaning, the conservative, the Republican, especially even in the Rust Belt, those types that all supported him for the things he said and for the things he said he was going to do, I would think at this point should start feeling like maybe they were cheated. Because he's not doing any of the things he said, and he's proven not to actually be a man of his words.
Well, a lot of people now do feel cheated, especially after the bombing in Syria. A lot of the reason that a lot of people, especially that I know, were supporting him was because he claimed to be anti-interventionist. He claimed to be largely into domestic issues, being a nationalist, being about the United States, closing our borders and keeping involved with our own problems.
Of course,
America first.
America
of course,
first.
He also, at the same time that he was telling people that, sometimes even in the same speeches, he didn't talk about how we need to bring back torture and, go in and take out the cartels and not just kill the terrorists, but then kill their families. So there was kind of a bit of a contradiction in what he was saying.
Yeah, but
not entirely consistent.
We've learned in elections that people choose which parts of the speech they want to remember afterward, and they were choosing to remember his non-interventionist, speeches, and he was really, I think personally, just lying on all of that. I mean, we've seen. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he thought he meant it, but then I think that's worse.
Yeah,
I would prefer lying, because if simply seeing some images of what happened to, the children after the sarin gas attack by Assad gets him to throw 50 tomahawks at an airfield, that's worse, because that means he's that reactionary.
Yeah, it's that incredibly easy to manipulate him.
Cognitive dissonance is there. What he's saying and what's happening are two different things. And I don't think it's just
what he's saying and what he's saying are two different things.
Fact, alternative fact too, right? But, and I think one of the big lessons that we get out of it for a generation of folks that were fairly disengaged, and I don't just mean millennials, I mean a whole generation in the country had become fairly apathetic with the political process, because it's not always the most interesting thing in the world. It may be to some of us and a lot of people listening, but it's not always to everybody in the country. I think one of the big benefits, if we can look at it this way, is a much more engaged and a much more pissed off group of people paying a lot more attention, learning a lot more about the details, and learning how to look beyond the facade. So I think that it's not necessarily that when you choose blind disruption. Disruption is a popular word these days in tech, but all around the world right now with things going on. And it's helping advance our society, civilization. But when you choose blind disruption, one of the outcomes you have to accept is this sense of, well, all that was really promised was something different. That's a little bit empty. That's a little bit hollow. There's no real promise. It's a lack of a promise, or a promise of different. And that different for him has a shade of different, but it just seems to end up echoing, especially with the cabinet choices to begin with in first 100 days in office, that really it was much more of the same, but his version of the same. And I think that's a lesson that people have to take out of it.
A less competent version of the same.
So, I mean, I heard an interesting positive kind of undertone there to what you were saying. And that was that because Trump is as bad and unpredictable as he happens to be, that a lot more people are now a lot more informed on politics simply because they kind of have to be in this craziness that we're currently dealing with.
People have a lot more access to more objective information, and obviously working on fake news is one of the ways to make sure it is more objective. But I think people are learning, ourselves included, that we're able to weed through the information. We're able to see, the bullshit, read through it, understand what people are reading between the lines for what's actually going on. And I think everybody's getting a lot better. At least I'm an optimist. I want to believe people are getting a lot better at weeding through. And I think it's a huge learning process right now in this, and that's a positive. But, another positive is, a much more highly engaged, more passionate group of people that want to make sure that the right things are done in government. You see a lot more people from, tech founders in Silicon Valley that are stepping up. People that were very disengaged and afraid to hurt their brands by being politically active are now willing to go on boards, even with Trump in office, because they believe might not follow all of Trump's policies or any of Trump's policies, but they want to at least be a leadership influence that gets some sort of say to try to benefit things in a positive way on some level.
Something has to give. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there we are. That is a lot of information to digest. But, after reading all these notes, studying up for all of this that we've talked about, and just paying attention for the last year, I don't believe, and this is going to sound weird, but I don't believe that Trump is as knowingly a puppet of the Russians. I don't think he's the type of guy who would be standing in a room shaking Putin's hand saying thanks for the election. I think he actually has too big of an ego to believe that other people had that big of a play. He thinks it was him. On the flip side of that, I believe that the Russians did have a lot to do with him winning that election. I believe that, their work against Hillary skewed it just enough to get Trump in place. And it's close. I mean, we're talking small percentage points, but you just need to move the dial a little. And the one thing that you brought up, Derek, is a lot of the fake news, right? Yeah. And one of the interesting things that you can read about in a lot of articles out there is that the Russians put a lot of effort into generating fake news and really pushing the narratives in complete lies, but pushing them on the social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and all these other places into these echo chambers that would then believe them because everyone else in the echo chamber believed them. And tactics like that we're learning are really successful. And we're also learning that Russia's really good at those tactics.
Yeah, it was during, I believe it was during the election that we first heard about the Russian troll factories, where that came out because people that worked at them went, hey, yeah, we were working at them. Here's what we were doing.
I think there's not a lot of incentive for any news organizations to be telling straight, neutral truths, right? Because no one cares to read that. No one cares to listen to that.
It's not sexy. It's not sensationalist.
Yeah, you've got everyone from CNN to Breitbart to Huffington Post, Slate, Washington Post, all just basically saying whatever it takes to make their audience feel good about themselves at this point. In order to maintain an audience, because that's how you make money.
But on that front, what I find interesting is you look at a CNN, right? And they're not right. They're not left. They lean a little more left than they do right, but they try to be more centrist, right? If you want to talk right and left, you're talking Fox and MSNBC. Like, they are easily on a side.
I don't even think that's fair. I'd say it'd be more like, Fox and like Mother Jones.
Sure. But, I always think of CNN as more in the center than those other brands, but that doesn't mean they're not, biased in a way. I think their bias is very specifically corporate.
And to that point, Greg, isn't it really important? I feel like it's really important, at least that it's something we've talked about before, that bias is inherent. We don't have to pretend that anybody's objective, especially when it's a media outlet. We might be objective to ourselves anyway, but that's our own kind of ego and perception of things, which is great. It's all fine and dandy, but media outlets especially, there's advertisers to consider, even morning shows, anywhere.
It's all about page views.
Absolutely.
All about page views. And if pushing the stories that Russia wants pushed drives the page views, they don't care.
For sure. Saying the wrong thing about an advertiser or a brand or an aligned brand or an umbrella company, these are all things that have a lot of influence, right?
Yeah, so, there's a lot of ways Russia affected this election, I believe. And I believe there's enough information out there, although some being hearsay, there's so much hearsay that, it kind of backs itself up there. I believe there's enough proven information that it looks like Russia did influence the election, did influence the Trump campaign, did have people it was paying on Trump's staff, and all of that speaks to serious problems for me. How about everyone else in the room here?
I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it there from my perspective, at least.
Absolutely. More resources to disrupt.
I think Trump had a very small pool of people to withdraw his employees from. I think he ended up with a couple people with ties to Russia because there's money in Russia, and a lot of the people who worked for him wanted money. I don't think that necessarily means that Russia was inherently involved in getting him elected. It seems like a lot of paranoia, and it seems like a new sort of McCarthyism, and it seems like it's getting driven by a lot of rich and powerful people in the United States who don't want Trump to have power.
Wouldn't it seem accurate to say then that, Hillary Clinton had one job? She had one job, and it was to not do the things that her advisors and handlers told her not to do. And then just time and time and time again, she did those exact same things.
That's what she knows how to do.
Certainly proved that one out.
The standard tactics weren't going to work against Trump, and obviously they didn't. But I think they weren't going to work against Trump and Putin personally. I don't know that we've proven any of that here, but definitely I think this was a great episode, everyone.
But I mean, there's a lot we haven't covered, but just lack of time and.
Yeah, we don't want this to go on for another 2 or 3 hours here.
Sorry.
I do, but
yeah. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna wrap up this one, and we're definitely not done with this topic though. Coming in to this year with this podcast starting right after Trump gets elected means that by pretty much no choice of our own, we're going to be talking about him quite a lot. That's mostly because I think he's going to continue to make mistakes and fail repeatedly over and over and over again.
And one of the ways, obviously, that we're going to continue to cover this, Greg, I know you talked about it before, was, the different guests we'll have on to cover some of these topics in a little bit more depth with a different perspective, which is really important for the way, you wanted this platform to be presented, was to get different points of view, different informed ones, just as valuable as people who, have an informed, agreeable perspective, but also the people who have an informed, disagreeable perspective to get all the information out there, right?
Absolutely. We will definitely be having more guests, more audiences, and starting next episode, we will be doing this live. So at some point in the near future, everyone who's actually listening to this stuff and has submitted their email address on GreggHoush.com will get an email saying, guess what? In a few hours, we're going to be live. And maybe not the first episode, maybe not even the second one, but definitely by the third live episode, we're going to have audience interaction in place. We're going to have the ability to take questions from the audience in place, and we're going to start moving forward with more and more of a audience say in what we're doing. And I think that's going to be great because I don't purport to know everything here. I think the audience is a little smarter than me. So let's get this all going. And next episode is going to be in a week. I think one of the big topics we're going to talk about then is going to be the over-prosecution problem And we're going to cover that in regards to the 21,000 plus cases that are getting thrown out due to a chemist's lies on the stand and in paperwork for a bunch of court cases here in Massachusetts, mostly pertaining to drug cases. Out of almost 26,000 cases, only 320 are going back to retrial, and the rest are all getting thrown out, and that's disturbing.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a special guest in on that one, so stay tuned.
The GreggHoush Show was created by GreggHoush and executive produced by co-host Derek Gowrays. Other contributors include producer and head writer Anna Jeffrey, producer-engineer David McGuffin, and producer-editor-engineer Robert Tortora. Theme music for this show was produced and recorded by Geneva de Colbert. Our interns include co-host Casey McLaughlin, writer-engineer Alec Greeny, and associate producer, writer, and announcer William Kennedy. You're listening to New Revolutionary Radio, your call to action.